Thomson Reuters Foundation. The initiative promotes the importance of recognizing legal ownership of Indigenous peoples and local communities' land rights as a prerequisite for achieving national and international goals for forest governance, food security, climate migration, economic development, and human rights. The Land Dialogue series will run once a month until October, with each webinar tackling a different topic. I'm Lori Gehring. I'm the climate change editor at the Thomson Reuters Foundation, and I'm happy to be your host today. We have a fantastic panel who I'll introduce you to shortly, but first a bit of housekeeping. The webinar will take place in English, but it'll be simultaneously interpreted to Spanish, French, and Portuguese. If you'd like to access that interpretation, please see the channels located at the bottom of your screen. There's an icon there you can click to see your choices. We'll have opening remarks and a discussion for about an hour, and then we'll take questions from the audience, which should just about take us to the allotted 90 minutes. As you think of questions for our panelists today, please post them using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, not the chat box feature. I'll then select some of those questions and pass them on to our panelists. If you're on social media, feel free to tweet using the @LandDialogues hashtag and follow live tweeting by the Land Portal and the Tenure Facility Twitter accounts. I should add that today's session is being recorded and you'll receive the link to it afterward. To begin, we'd like to get to know a bit about those of you in the audience. I know that there are about 600 people who have signed up for this webinar today, which is a reflection of the huge interest in today's topic. Let's find out a bit more about who's with us with a couple of short questions. You should see up on your screen now those questions. If you could please select one of the choices on which region you're based in. And we'd also like to ask you which sector you work in. If you could fill that in as well, that would be fantastic. Okay. Interesting. It's looking like we have more participants from Asia today than anywhere else, with Latin America and North America coming close after that. And in terms of different organizations, non-governmental organizations are the dominant one, but we have a lot of civil society people with us and students as well. So that's interesting. Thanks for that. Okay, so now let me introduce you to our panel today. First up, we have Dr. Pasang Dolma Sherpa, who is Executive Director of the Center for Indigenous Peoples Research and Development, which has been working for more than a decade with Indigenous peoples at the local, national, and global levels to promote and recognize their traditional knowledge, cultural practices, skills, and customary institutions, which contribute to sustainable management of their natural resources, the forests, ecosystems, biodiversity, and climate change resilience. We also have with us Marissa Fernandez, who is a Quebecer Indigenous leader, founder of the Katsako Women's Group, and an activist of Indigenous women's rights for more than 15 years. She's president of the Territorial Organization of Indigenous Women, Kabata Konana, which means Defenders of the Mountain. During the COVID-19 pandemic, she's been leading the cultural access of the care plan with her association. We also have Holly Jonas, who is the global coordinator of the ECA Consortium. She's passionate about social and environmental justice and has a lifelong dedication to supporting those movements. After volunteering and working with the ECA Consortium for more than 10 years, she now serves as the global coordinator of it. Holly draws from an interdisciplinary background in public international law, cultural anthropology, zoology, nonprofit leadership, transnational advocacy, and multimedia. Next, we have Duncan McQueen. He's an expert on forest enterprise issues and local to global governance processes that affect forests. He's currently the team leader on forests within the International Institute for Environment and Development, overseeing work under an overall goal of resilient forests, prosperous people. As well, we have Osvaldo Nankimo, who's a Guarani activist, political spokesperson for the Guarani Resistance, a human rights and nature defender, and co-founder of the Sable Alliance, a foundation that brings together people from the Aikopan, Siona, Sekolpai, and Guarani Indigenous peoples. It works to defend their rights to land and natural resources in Ecuador, Peru, and Colombia. Osvaldo is currently studying to become the first Guarani lawyer. Okay, let's get into the discussion and then the Q&A. Remember, you can submit questions via the box below, the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. That's not the chat box that's on the right. In the spirit of allowing time for everyone to speak, I'd urge panelists to keep their answers relatively brief, not least so we can leave some time for all the questions. And I also would urge everyone to speak slowly to allow our interpreters time to make sure your comments reach all of our listeners. Osvaldo, let's start with you. How are Indigenous peoples building climate change resilience? Can you bring or give us specific examples from your own community?
Muy buenos días, mi nombre es Osvaldo Nenquimo, soy guaraní de la Amazonía ecuatoriana. Nosotros como pueblos indígenas de la Amazonía y compensando a cambios climáticos que suceden en las comunidades, hay mucha diferenciación con unos 10 años atrás teníamos otros tipos de clima en nuestras comunidades. También teníamos otros tipos de vivencia en las comunidades. Actualmente sentimos que ha cambiado como el tiempo de vida, como tiempo del sol, tiempo de lluvia. Tenemos también otros modos sentimos como que ha cambiado mucho en más como ámbito climático, porque sentimos nosotros antes no era así. Los abuelos dicen que éramos antes de aquí unos 10 años, 20 años atrás, vivíamos diferente, pero actualmente sentimos como se ha cambiado diferente en ámbito de la lluvia, y ahora no tenemos más como cacería, y sentimos que nosotros creemos en nuestra selva, nuestra casa, y nos habla la selva misma en ámbito espiritual. Dice que el mundo nos castiga, y cuando nos dicen los abuelos el mundo nos castiga, y no entendemos por qué dicen ese mundo castiga, porque nosotros a la madre naturaleza, la vida de la selva, nosotros mismos estamos como haciendo malas cosas, castigando a la selva, y la selva nos castiga. Entonces eso es como nosotros hemos dado cuenta que el mundo castiga porque nosotros no estamos haciendo buena forma de cuidar la selva, cuidar el mundo, cuidar el oxígeno que tenemos la selva. La selva nos da el oxígeno para respirar, pero a todos en el mundo. Pero nosotros siempre hemos estado defendiendo, cuidando la selva, los árboles, para que nos dé oxígeno para vivir bien. Pero no es solo vivir bien, pero igual tenemos muchas amenazas que llegan a nuestros territorios, pero igual debemos como proteger desde las comunidades para la vida de nuestros hijos, para dejar un legado histórico con la selva limpio, territorio limpio, los ríos limpios, el oxígeno limpio para que los niños respiren bien, para que siga manteniendo nuestra cultura a larga generación.
Okay, thank you so much, Osvaldo. It's really interesting. Dr. Passon, can you answer the same question for us? How are Indigenous peoples building climate change resilience? Can you give us some specific examples from your own community?
Thank you, Laurie, for the question. As shared by Osvaldo, the situation of Indigenous peoples and the role and contribution of Indigenous peoples around the world is almost same. The Indigenous peoples have continuously contributing for climate change resilience, because the resilience is part of their culture, part of their spiritual, their day-to-day life. But the problem is that connection with the people, with the nature, the connectivity, the symbiotic relation has not been able to understand. That has been the main causes of what we have been facing today. So, when you see the example, there are plenty of examples. When you go to the community, or when you are brought up when you were young and in the community, all the memories that you have lived so far, when you recall those memories, how glorious we could memorize how glorious those days were, because we hardly had the carbon footprints, because our culture, our practices, it's really contributed for sustaining the resources. Indigenous people collect the resources only that they need for their survivals, not on the grid base, not on the capitalistic worldview of getting more and more and more and over exploitation. So those people, and I would be more than happy to share just a few examples from our community in the context of Nepal. In Nepal, we have 59 and recently 60 indigenous different groups that has been legally recognized in 1990. Most of the indigenous peoples, almost more than 70% of the indigenous people, is still living in the rural area. As you are already aware that how indigenous people have been contributing to the impacts of climate change, climate resilience, the outcome of the study of many research, including ICBES or IUCN or ILO or IPCC. So in Chepang is one of the indigenous groups, so who are still living in the forest, in the rural area. So when Chepang community, they go to the forest and collect the roots for their food, they always worship. And then they take the permission before they take out the roots for their food, as the means of food for their family. And then also they don't take all the roots, but they take only the roots for their family and leaving the small plants and roots for next year. Similar examples of the mountain indigenous peoples, like almost 90% of the communities in the mountain in Nepal are indigenous people. So who are still depending on the herbal traditional medicinal for their treatment, even in the pandemic. So when they go to collect the forest for the herbs and different medicinal plants, they collect only what is needed for them, and remaining the putting behind all the small plants and other plants to be collected next year. So similarly, we have also one sacred tradition in Chumnubri with the principles of non-violence and principles. So strictly forbidden of the prohibition from killing even domestic or wild animals, or even honey hunting or fire, all this our cultural, our customary institutional governance system of the practices, our all are nature-based solution and contributing for climate change resilience. But the problem we have been facing is not being understanding the connectivity of indigenous people and the nature. Thank you, Logan.
Thank you. Yeah, this thing about resilience being part of the culture, it's really at the root of a lot of this, isn't it? Marissa, can we turn to you now? How are Indigenous peoples building climate change resilience in your community, your part of the world. Can you give us some examples from your community? May take just a moment to get Maricella's video turned on and so on. Just give her a second. Are you able to hear us, Maricella? I'll give you a couple more minutes to see if we can sort that out. If not, we'll go on to our next panelist and we'll come back to you. I think we've all learned that these are uncertain times and we work as we can. Okay, I'm going to move on just for the moment while we sort out getting Maricella on with us to Holly. Holly, in May this year, the ICA Consortium released a report on Indigenous peoples and local communities' territories of life. It's really, the videos are beautiful, really impressive to watch. Can you tell us a bit more about that report, its findings, and the key recommendations, and a little bit about the authors as well?
Absolutely. Thank you, Laurie. And thank you for the opportunity to share this space with such powerful Indigenous leaders as well. It's wonderful to meet new people from around the world. So overall, the ICC Consortium's new report on territories of life really adds to this growing body of evidence that our fellow speakers have already shared today. It's this evidence that Indigenous peoples and local communities are so central to sustaining the diversity of life on Earth that it would be impossible to address our interlinked biodiversity and climate crises without them. And this report takes a unique local to global approach to understanding not just what Indigenous peoples and local communities are doing to contribute to a healthy planet, but also how and why they are doing so. Nearly 100 people were involved in producing this report. It includes 17 case studies of specific territories from 5 continents, 6 national and regional analyses focusing on the legal policy recognition, and the most up-to-date global spatial analysis of how much of the planet is likely conserved by Indigenous peoples and local communities. And it's backed up by an executive summary of all of these components. So it's kind of multi-level, multi-component report. And I'll briefly share the 5 overall key findings. And I hope you can check out the full report, especially the students on the call. We'd always appreciate feedback. So the first key finding is that, as our fellow speakers have shared already, Indigenous peoples and local communities play an outsized role in the governance, conservation, and sustainable use of the world's biodiversity and nature. They actively protect and conserve this astounding diversity of species, of habitats, and ecosystems, which in turn provides the basis for clean water and air, healthy food and livelihoods for people far beyond their boundaries. The second key finding is that Indigenous peoples and local communities' contributions to a healthy planet are rooted in and inseparable from the deep relationships between their cultures, their collective lands and territories, their governance systems, and the other species and spiritual beings with whom they coexist. They're also contributing significantly to the world's cultural and linguistic heritage. The third key finding is that Indigenous peoples and local communities are the de facto custodians of many existing protected and conserved areas that are recognized officially by governments. And they're also conserving an estimated 17% of the world's land outside of these official protected and conserved areas. So if they were appropriately recognized alongside the quote unquote official ones, the total coverage would increase to 31% of the world's land, which already surpasses these global calls for 30% protected and conserved by 2030. Now, however, as I'm sure many people in this webinar know, in a significant number of the case studies in this report, Indigenous peoples and local communities have really contentious relationships with the mainstream conservation sector, depending on the extent to which their rights and governance systems and ways of life are respected and upheld. In other cases, though, they are strategically trying to use protected area laws and different conservation designations to defend against other threats, such as mining. Now, fourth, Indigenous peoples and local communities are on the front lines of resisting the main industrial drivers of global biodiversity loss and climate breakdown, including mining, oil and gas, logging, and monoculture plantations. They often face violence and retribution for resisting these industries, and these threats can have cumulative and compounded effects on communities, which in turn pose longer-term threats to their resilience. However, they continue to resist and respond in really powerful and diverse ways. And this leads to the final key finding, which is that even in the face of these immense threats, whether from top-down conservation or from harmful industries, Indigenous peoples and local communities have this extraordinary resilience and determination. They're adapting to rapidly changing contexts and using diverse strategies to secure their rights and territories. Although they do sometimes face setbacks, they have made key advances, and they're continuing to do so in pursuit of self-determination, self-governance, peace, and sustainability. Now, as the UN negotiations in the biodiversity and climate processes intensify this year, the time really is now to recognize Indigenous peoples and local communities as the true agents of transformative change, and supporting them to secure their rights and collective lands and territories of life is arguably this key missing link in global commitments as well as national level implementation. And therefore, it's also a huge opportunity for leadership and convergence in these negotiation processes. So in practical terms, pursuing this agenda will require a massive increase in social, political, legal, institutional, and financial support for Indigenous peoples and local communities, primarily from state governments, but also from public and private financial institutions. So it's really time, I think, for social movements and civil society organizations working on all these different issues, whether it's human rights, conservation, climate justice, or land issues, to really come together and work on this shared agenda together. So I really hope that helps summarize. I'd be happy to respond to any further questions, and I'll add a link to the report in the chat box as well. Thank you, Laurie.
Thank you. It is interesting how this is an opportunity to bring together so many different communities that might not have thought of themselves from, as working on the same efforts. Maricela, are you with us? Can you hear me? And there you are, fantastic. I'll speak slowly. I know we need to get some interpretation done, but we would love to hear how Indigenous peoples are building climate change resilience in your communities, and particularly to hear a few examples of how that's happening. Maricela, you are muted. Can we unmute Maricela, please? We don't want to miss what she says. Ah, perfect. I think we can hear you now.
Bueno, ¿me escuchan? ¿Cómo hemos venido con... Sí, ok. Bueno, nosotros en estos pueblos, hemos venido fortaleciendo. ¿Cómo lo hemos hecho? Fortaleciendo los conocimientos tradicionales y ancestrales de nuestro pueblo. Porque de ahí, ¿cómo? Poniendo en práctica lo que es la siembra cultural de la producción tradicional, con ese conocimiento ancestral, también, ¿cómo se llama? La forma de producción tradicional que está basado a la categoría nuestra, Eso hace que nosotros podamos rotar la tierra y podamos sembrar culturalmente. Y también, ¿cómo se llama? Nosotros hemos participado en lo que es la parte de construir el liderazgo de la mujer desde el principio cosmogónico, cultural, con nuestra propia cosmovisión indígena, porque ahí es donde nace la base principal, donde nosotros podemos decir cómo queremos abordar la siembra cultural, las plantas medicinales, la conservación de los recursos naturales, ¿cómo se llama? El conocimiento que nos heredan nuestros ancestros, pues poniéndole en prácticas en nuestro trabajo diario que tenemos que trabajar como pueblos indígenas. En esto hemos trabajado, ha mejorado, digamos, la siembra cultural, lo que es la seguridad alimentaria de las familias. Trabajamos con 110 familias en el territorio donde yo vivo. Se ha mejorado, digamos, se ha mejorado la seguridad alimentaria, los intercambios, los trueques, que a base de ese conocimiento cultural, nuestros mayores nos han dicho, bueno, por la pandemia hay que retrocederlos y tenemos que volver a nuestra cultura, a nuestra cosmovisión, a nuestra identidad cultural, porque eso es que marca la diferencia. ¿Por qué? Porque nosotros, quizás en este momento, en anteriores, nosotros estábamos enfocados muchos en la producción monocultivo, y entonces esto nos afecta de una manera de que nosotros tenemos que trabajar, diversificar las parcelas, fincas agroforestales, producción sostenible y que también fortalezca el medio ambiente. Y entonces todo este trabajo nos hemos enfocado, y ahí es donde hemos trabajado a la Feria del Estanco Indígena de Trueque Virtual, donde hemos intercambiado semilla, así como el Museo Vivo Resguardo de Semilla, semillas criollas que sea resistente al cambio climático, ya que en estos momentos que estamos viviendo, el tiempo que se nos ha complicado, que hay terribles inundaciones, y de igual manera, de un momento a otro hay mucho verano. Entonces, hemos venido trabajando desde el principio de nuestro territorio ante esta situación, ante la pandemia, de que nosotros podamos enfocarnos algo culturalmente y fortalecer ese conocimiento cultural, fortalecer ese principio de nuestra identidad cultural, basado a todo lo que mencioné, a la creación de estos 4 sistemas productivos que nosotros nos hemos enfocado en la parte de la sistema de producción tradicional, el estanco indígena de trueque virtual, los proyectos culturales de artesanía, que son cosas que nosotros son nuestras, pero lo hemos descuidado y nos hemos enfocado en eso, y en las huertas tradicionales que también tenemos en nuestras parcelas. Entonces, esas son las acciones concretas que nosotros hemos venido trabajando como organización.
Muchas gracias, Marissa. I'm going to give just a second for the interpreters to catch up on that. Thank you. It's really interesting to hear about the farming. Okay, next we would like to go to Duncan, who has had some interesting recently published case studies written by local forest and farm producer organizations and funded directly by the Forest and Farm Facility about those organizations' efforts to become climate resilient. Duncan, can you tell us a little bit about those?
Yes, thanks, Laurie. Yeah, the Forest and Farm Facility, it's a partnership and it directly funds Indigenous peoples and forest and farm producer organizations to achieve 4 main things: better policies, more enabling policies, stronger businesses, and then climate resilience is the 3rd one, alongside social and cultural protection services for marginalized groups. And by the end of 2020, I think some 99 organizations out of the many hundreds we support had developed these climate resilience plans across 10 partner countries where we're working. So the way the FFF works is to co-produce knowledge. We understand that farmer groups learn best from one another in sort of peer-to-peer learning. but it also helps to dip into the academic world to make sure what we're spreading knowledge about is best practice. So we did two things. We invited some farmer organizations and their support partners to write these 10 case studies about their climate resilience plans from places like Bolivia, Ecuador, Ghana, Kenya, Madagascar, Tanzania, Togo, Zambia, Nepal, and Vietnam. And these were published last year. And at the same time, we were looking at we were doing some research to think about how other people are describing climate resilience and ways to approach it. And from that literature, we documented 30 different practical ways that people are becoming more resilient. Now, we planned a big exchange with the producer organizations that were scheduled to happen in Vietnam, where they would see these climate resilience things, but COVID-19 put pay to that. So instead, we've been trying to arrange webinars to exchange views and experiences on this topic. And a critical point from the case studies is that, you know, farmer resilience or smallholder resilience or indigenous peoples resilience, it's not just about the farming system, although that's very important, but there are a range of practical sets of things they can do, and which we came up with these 30 different things. And ecologically, they can, of course, do things like plant more resilient crops or livestock, or enrich their soils, or plant nitrogen fixing trees, manage pests and diseases better. So lots of ecological things that mean less failure on the farm. Socially, of course, they can do many things as well. They can strengthen their voice and representation for rights, link to other organizations that can help them with services and technical support for even their businesses, less isolation. And then economically, it helps to upgrade your businesses and to diversify what you produce so that there's less risk of failure. Diversifying not just the different products, but sort of packaging and marketing, having more ways of selling what you do, so more stable incomes. And finally, you can invest in a whole range of sort of physical and technological things, everything from fire breaks and building terraces and irrigation to communications using mobile phones and so on. And what was really striking about all this is that once we'd done the look at what people were saying about resilience, when we went back to our 10 case studies from forest and farm producers, we found that most of the local forest and farm organizations were already doing most of these things. You know, they're wizards at resilience already, and I guess they have to be in order to survive. And I think that was the striking thing.
Yeah, it's so interesting, isn't it? You always hear this saying that necessity is the mother of invention, right? And it's impressive to me as we report on a lot of these things, how many of the solutions have already come out of local communities, you know, well ahead of when people in the global north actually began to start thinking about these things. Duncan, we would love to just hear a little bit more specifically about one of these case studies. Can you tell us a bit more about the one from Zambia, which is about the diversified climate resilient business model of the Tubaleke Club?
That's right. Yes, certainly. Yes, it's a 26 member women's enterprise group called the Tubaleke Women's Club. And it's in a very dry southwest Zambia in Choma district. I wish you could meet their leader, Juliet Machona. She should have been doing this, but she's a real star, really inspiring. And it's a tough place to live. The rains are becoming increasingly erratic with climate change. The growing seasons shortening often to less than 80 days, barely enough time to grow your staple crops. So this women's group formed in about 2002, trying to get a fertilizer credit program from the government. That was long since finished when we met them. And they approached the Forest and Farm Facility to see if we could help them with climate resilient livelihoods. So we provided a bit of training, and then we've been supporting them through several years based around their own plans for enterprise development and climate. And they'd identified a way of diversifying away from subsistence agriculture by basket weaving from local bamboo and grass. There's a good local market for that in the local towns. And they'd set up this savings and loans fund to build up their finances. And that was really the foundation of their resilience. So for example, from the profits from the basket selling, they then diversified into rearing pigs and sheep. And then with the animal manure, they installed a sort of a biogas cook stove facility for the women. And the biogas creates, obviously the waste product is slurry, which is it's very good fertilizer for their agricultural crops. And so they're in a tough climate, so they're planting bamboo to keep the basket weaving growing. But in about the second year of their activity, a major drought hit southern Zambia. And it was really their social organization and their savings and loans group that saved them, because they pumped, in effect, a whole year's profit just into feeding the women and their families during the drought. But you know, the drought was over, and being a strong group has really helped them strengthen their options. And so one of the things they managed to do was to attract some outside project funding to install a borehole, and that's a real you know, godsend for them in that environment. And now they hope to be able to grow their own animal feed with a little bit of irrigation, as well as diversifying into vegetable production. So you can see that the women's group is doing a whole heap of things to become more resilient. They're real champions at it. You know, they've diversified what they've produced to give them more options ecologically, so they have less risk of farm failure. They've strengthened their group and their networks, social networks and links, including to something called the Zambia National Forest Commodity Association, which helps them market some of their products like the baskets. And they've broadened their business options, not just basket weaving, but livestock and perhaps vegetables in the future. And they're upgrading their infrastructure, their boreholes and irrigation, getting mobile phones to contact markets, biogas, composting, and so on. So they're already, when you actually tot it up, of those 30 different things you could do, they're doing about half of them, of all the practical options we documented from the academic literature. And that's really the message, is that these people, these groups are very competent at climate resilience. And also the sort of resilience they're building is often involving forest and plant stuff that helps mitigate climate change as well. So it's a win-win for everyone.
So interesting. Is that pretty typical, Duncan, of groups, or is this group really particularly good at it?
No, in fact, I picked probably the most remote and smallest and weakest group.
Wow.
Just because they survived the drought through this process. But actually, some of the groups are much higher up the list of 30 than doing really quite sophisticated things involving finance and credit and all sorts. So we're producing a book on it called Diversification for Resilience. It'll be out later this year. And you can see some of the examples in it.
Okay. No, it's also really interesting to actually see things tested in sort of real time while you're there, rather than just wondering how that's going to hold up in the future. So.
Yeah.
Dr. Passan, can I turn to you? I was curious, in your view, whether Indigenous peoples and local communities are sufficiently involved in this discussion on how to adapt to climate change, kind of at all levels. What do you think? Are they still on the outskirts and not involved enough?
Laurie, I could not put my video on. Maybe, I don't know. Maybe.
Okay, don't worry. Just go ahead and speak to us, and
Okay.
the team can maybe help you.
Okay, just to would be sometime face to face would be maybe better.
Sure.
Than being the virtual has already made people so far away, and hiding inside the curtain makes more far away. So just try just to be.
We can see you now. There you are.
Yeah. Okay. Good. Now I feel more
Thank
live to be connected with all of you. Yeah, I think thank you for the question. So is it the question is more like how the discussion is going on in the indigenous peoples, or could you please repeat one more the question?
Yeah, sure. I was curious how you see Indigenous peoples and local communities being involved in these discussions at all levels on how to adapt to climate change. Are they sufficiently involved, or are they still at the fringes of these discussions?
Oh, okay, got it. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, as from the discussion earlier also shows like somehow the indigenous peoples and the local communities issues and concerns is on the table of discussion, right? Because of maybe different projects or initiatives like that. And the efforts of engaging of indigenous people, local communities, we can already feel, in all level. Either in international or regional or even national or local, no? If you see in the international level, maybe I just give you some few examples of how the efforts of engaging indigenous people and local communities already started, along with the adoption of the local communities and indigenous people platform by the UNCCC, United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, I think COP21 in 2015 in Paris. So along with the establishment of the platform of indigenous people and local communities, that has been a kind of a starting point of officially, engaging of indigenous peoples on the same table as state parties. Because I have been also following the climate change negotiation almost more than a decade, since 2009. In my experience, in those days, in 2008, 2009, when I was already beginner in following this negotiation, they just to point out the indigenous people name even in the bracket of the negotiation is really out of your imagination. But now you can see, like I was actually the former co-chair of the LCIP of the UNCCC. And then I was working as a co-chair along with the co-chair of the state parties. So that was obviously seen like a discussion at the international level. Internalizing the important role and contribution of indigenous people is already felt in the UNCCC as CVD, and also the sustainable developments in all other the international discussion and discourse in relation to climate change. However, even the discussion of that international engagement of indigenous people in the same level as the state parties, however, there is still a lot of challenges because of the capacity buildings, the awareness level of indigenous people to have their meaningful and effective participation along with the other concerned bodies. That part is there, but another part is the capacity of not only indigenous people, but other state parties and other negotiators for understanding the role and contribution of indigenous people. That is the part is also a big gap, no? Because first of all, for the meaningful participation, the indigenous people's own role and capacity is another challenging part. But more than that, another challenging part is not understanding the role and contribution of indigenous people for climate change resilience. That is more worst part of challenges. So at the national level, if you see in some example, like a few countries like Sweden, Mexico, Canada, they have a few examples, we can count it, how they are really engaging indigenous peoples on the climate change discourse at the national level in the climate change policy framework. Nepal is also in progressive states in comparison to when you see the past 10 years, the engagement of indigenous people. However, one of the most challenging I have felt like at the national level in the context of Nepal, most of the climate change framework, the climate change policy framework, like for example, National Adaptation Plan or national determined contribution that they have submitted to the UNCCC, more are basing on the secondary data. So the absence of disaggregated data, especially to reflect that how indigenous people and local communities, women, have contributed for climate change resilience. Why they're not the active actors, the key actors in the discourse of climate change, in the solution of climate change and the resilience of climate change to deal with the this whole crisis is hardly been reflected. So this is a big gap and challenges. So having said that, there are much more things to be done in terms of capacity building, full and meaningful engagements in the climate discourse in all levels.
That's really,
yeah.
It's really interesting that women are still left out now. After so long of trying to push ahead on this. Certainly, it's an ongoing problem. And I think your question about this kind of meaningful participation is going to be a big one, and not just for Indigenous people, coming up at COP26 as we try to deal with the vaccine travel restrictions and online systems that are not always perfect for everyone, particularly in the more remote place you're coming from. I was just curious, is there anything particular you're wanting to see out of COP26 this year, given you've been following the policy so closely?
Yeah, actually, the COP26 is, we have been strategizing ourselves very closely, especially I'm still the member of the FWG of the LCIP in the UNCCC, representing Asia along with the 7 socio-cultural regions around the world, along with the state parties there. We have been I have been co-leading 3 of the 2 out of 12 activities in order to fulfill the 3 purposes of the LCIP: the knowledge, capacity building, climate change policy and action. So in order to reach 3 purposes of this platform, we have been implementing different activities. So one of the 3 activities out of 12 where I'm actively, I'm directly involved as a co-lead is like engaging state parties, layers of the dialogue with the indigenous people leaders, and on the same table, dialogue with the state parties to understand how important role indigenous people have been playing. Like, for example, the kind of dialogue now you are holding now, like, sharing experience, because that part is really lacking, no? Because indigenous people are often misinterpreted, right? Because indigenous people have been seen like objectively rather subjectively, right? So this is the time that indigenous people speak their own voice rather being interpreted or reinterpreted by another voice, right? And that's how the misinterpretation on the role and contribution of indigenous people, no? So that is what we have been doing. The most important part we have been doing is how we can promote the indigenous people curriculum in the formal and informal education. So we are inviting all the ministries who are really promoting for indigenous knowledge in the respective country in line with the Action Climate Empowerment, that is one of the constituent bodies of the UNCCC, as well as the different university and research centers who've been working closely with the indigenous people to promote and encourage, and also to make sure that indigenous people's knowledge system will be implemented through their education curriculum, so that our young generation will learn the values, the cultural, spiritual values that contributed for climate change resilience.
Thank you so much. That's really interesting, and I think something people can get involved in then if they like.
Yeah, I'm more than happy to respond if there is any queries. Yeah,
you know where to find her.
Yeah.
Yeah. Osvaldo, I'd like to turn back to you now. How can resilience be strengthened in your community, do you think? And then what of those lessons that you've learned in resilience can be transferred to other communities nearby and further afield?
Bueno, gracias nuevamente. Yo quiero como más como explicar ese momento, una oportunidad en este vía Zoom, ha sido como exponer nuestra voz desde pueblos indígenas que vivimos en la selva, en una comunidad, como dar un voz, mensaje al mundo sobre resiliencia climática o cambio climático que sucede en el mundo. Nuestro mensaje desde como nacionalidad indígena guaraní de Ecuador, de la Amazonía, que vivimos en un pulmón del mundo, que hay bastante árboles como mega diverso. Entonces nosotros desde la comunidad hemos aprendido la lucha y la resistencia contra el extractivismo, con el Estado, con los petroleros. Entonces nosotros hemos dado un duro batalla y hemos ganado con gobiernos, con los petroleros, como sentencias judiciales, hemos ganado. Esa es la resistencia, ese es como favor de la resiliencia climática. Y nosotros, nuestro mensaje, como una compañera decía que a veces a los pueblos indígenas, los gobiernos, la gente occidental piensa que no sabemos, como no sabemos pensar, gente blanco mestizo da pensando. Eso creo que es equivocado, hay que decir muy claro. Nosotros sí sabemos cómo gobernar nuestro territorio, administrar nuestro territorio, porque nosotros somos únicos en el mundo que protegemos el aire y el oxígeno en el mundo. Pero la gente no entiende esto. Entonces ese mensaje queremos que el mundo une la lucha a favor del cambio climático para sostener a largo plazo. Actualmente en nuestra comunidad Aren, en la selva, estamos trabajando mucho un reencuentro de jóvenes, porque los sabios, abuelos, ellos son como fundamental, que han liderado mucho tiempo, como protegiendo la selva. Pero la juventud nueva no entiende qué es el cambio climático, qué es la defensa del territorio, los derechos de nosotros. No entienden, quieren solo explotar los recursos. Pero muy importante que hemos hecho nosotros como indígena orani, reencuentro de dos conocimientos como los sabios de los sabios y los juventud. Un reencuentro, ese es como un buen camino, un buen señal sobre cambio climático, resiliencia climática, y para tener una conexión dos juntos, porque la juventud ya nosotros hablamos español, algunos hablan inglés, pero los que viven como líderes, como los asesores, los abuelos que han defendido la selva, hablan solo guaraní, como otro idioma. Es como ahorita estamos una conexión constante para estar listos cualquier cosa que llegue a nuestro territorio, para frenar, para proteger la selva, porque a veces mucho blanco mestizo a nosotros en el Ecuador ha tildado, los indígenas de Ghana están hablando de defensa o que nosotros queremos saquear para el desarrollo del país. Pero igual la gente blanco mestiza y los gobiernos no entienden. Nosotros somos defensores, protegemos para que el mundo viva, la gente viva en las ciudades con oxígeno bueno, pero la gente solo quiere venir a saquear, explotar, dañar y dejar la muerte y contaminación. Pero el blanco mestizo y los gobiernos no piensan como nosotros, como indígenas, protegemos la selva para dar mejor oxígeno en el mundo. Ese es como mi mensaje. Queremos alguna oportunidad de seguir hablando, para seguir uniendo, tejiendo como más estrategia comunicacional, para que visibilice el mundo, ¿no? La lucha de resiliencia climática, también cambio climático que pasa en el mundo. Muchas gracias.
Thank you. It is really interesting what you say about the, having fought so many hard battles over the years and this ability of resistance. I mean, you know how to govern and protect your territory, which is saying something. Is certainly the kind of knowledge that many other places around the world that need protection could learn from. And it's interesting that you mentioned youth and how to manage that, because I think we're going to turn to our questions and answer section now. And I actually have a first question for you about that. But let me first just remind everyone, if you'd like to ask a question, there's still plenty of time to put those in. And if you just go down to the Q&A button at the bottom, that will open up for you, and feel free to type your question in any language that you're comfortable with, at least Spanish, Portuguese, French, or English, and we'll make sure it gets to people in the right language that they understand. First, I'd like to ask Osvaldo, but also Marissa on this one. How are youth involved in climate change action in your country and in your community? If you could talk us through a little bit of that. Can we start with you, Osvaldo?
Sí, gracias nuevamente. Bueno, amigos, como en nuestra comunidad, como pueblos indígenas en la Amazonía, antes no estaba más involucrado la juventud, como ya mencioné, actualmente estamos uniendo la acción. Porque la acción, quiero decir, como yo soy como tercera, cuarta generación guaraní que ha salido a hablar español, pero mi pueblo habla otro idioma guauterero, entonces esa es la conexión que tenemos, la voz como hacia afuera, desde comunidad dando mensaje hacia afuera y trabajando juntos con dos sabiduría en la comunidad. Ha sido como muy bueno la juventud actual que llamamos a muchos jóvenes, como muy jóvenes, llamamos en nuestro encuentro de asamblea grande para discutir, analizar qué queremos hacer, cómo vamos a hacerlo frente a las amenazas que pueden llegar en nuestro territorio. Estamos haciendo más vinculados a la participación colectiva, decisión colectiva, enseñando a la juventud, porque igual la juventud luego en el futuro debe llegar a este liderazgo de enfrentar, luchar por su territorio y más especialmente como la gente llega a nuestro territorio, porque igual la acción decimos que la juventud trabaje con mucha reflexión, con mucho diálogo a favor de esos recursos que tenemos en la selva, porque igual sin la juventud no funciona en nuestra comunidad, sin juventud no va a ir muy lejos, porque los sabios, líderes, abuelos, van a perder muy corto tiempo porque ya son adultos, pero la juventud es un legado histórico, pero necesitamos capacitar, formar líderes, que sean nuevos líderes. Entonces, la acción ha sido de la juventud con mucho como aprender, como una formación constante, porque la juventud es va a ser como futura generación liderando en su territorio, ¿no? Entonces, eso es como importante la juventud vincular, porque a veces la juventud, nosotros mucho tiempo hemos dejado a un lado solo con los líderes, ¿no? Entonces hay que vincular, como hay que participar para que entienda, que aprenda, porque ese es el camino de nuestro sueño, ¿no? Eso es como yo pienso que estamos haciendo como más acción en el campo.
Okay, thank you. That's really interesting. Maricela, can I ask you the same thing about what you're seeing with youth involved in climate change action in your community, in your country? How is that going?
Wait.
Can you hear us, Maricela?
¿Me escucha?
We can hear you. We can hear you. We can't see you yet, but that's not so important. Please go ahead.
¿Sí me escucha?
Yes, sí.
Sí. Sí, ¿cómo? ¿Cuál es la pregunta? Sí.
I'll let the translator.
¿Cómo es la pregunta?
My question was how are youth involved in climate change action in your community and your country?
Ok. Vea, nosotros como bueno, nuestros jóvenes se ha venido descuidando mucho la parte cultural, los conocimientos culturales tradicionales por defender la naturaleza, lo que es la parte de lo que hablé, las plantas medicinales, la defensa del territorio, la gobernanza territorial, ¿cómo se llama? Todo lo que tiene que ver con lo que es la parte cultural nuestro. Entonces, por eso es que hemos retrocedido y hemos trabajado con los ancianos, con los mayores, para que estos jóvenes se puedan capacitar y escuchar a nuestros ancianos y puedan ver que por qué es importante conservar los recursos naturales, por qué es importante las plantas medicinales, por qué es importante la agricultura tradicional, por qué es importante para nosotros como pueblos indígenas con la conservación de los bosques para la protección de las nacientes y quebradas, la diversificación de productos agrícolas, todo eso para lo que es la parte de lo que es el cambio, para la creación del cambio climático, porque nosotros muchas veces nuestros jóvenes están que no quieren participar y desconoce totalmente la parte cultural, porque es que nosotros lo defendemos. Entonces ahí es donde entra la parte de los talleres comunitarios con los jóvenes para que ellos puedan escuchar porque, cómo se puede construir las casas culturales, los ranchos culturales que nosotros decimos, por qué es importante, cuáles son los materiales y las herramientas que se utilizan para esa construcción y por qué es importante esa construcción, cuál es su importancia y la espiritualidad, la conexión con el bosque. Eso es algo que nosotros hemos venido descuidando, pero los jóvenes bueno, ya se han involucrado, ya han venido escuchando a los mayores y hemos venido trabajando en conjunto en el tema de también la artesanía cultural, que es otro conocimiento cultural que nosotros tenemos como pueblo, pero lo hemos venido, digamos, anteriormente lo hemos descuidado, pero hoy hemos venido trabajando con los jóvenes en esos temas. Y hoy ante la pandemia, la pandemia nos sirvió para fortalecer ese reencuentro de jóvenes sobre los conocimientos culturales. ¿Por qué? Porque en este momento de la pandemia se utilizó mucho lo que es la planta medicinal. Quizás muchas personas ya no creían en la planta medicinal. Y de la pandemia en los territorios indígenas lo combatimos con las medicinas tradicionales. Y entonces ellos desconocían para qué sirve, cuál es y cómo se llama y cuál es su función. Y entonces ahí es donde entramos al taller de lo que es talleres culturales para que todos podamos encontrarnos y tener un reencuentro y ver para atrás lo importante que son los conocimientos nuestros como pueblos indígenas y el aporte que hemos hecho para lo que es el cambio climático, la resistencia. Pues hemos sido una base tan fundamental para el desarrollo, para la humanidad, porque toda la conservación, el aire, lo que hemos conservado nosotros como territorios indígenas, pues eso no solamente le va a servir a los territorios indígenas, eso es para todo lo que vivimos en el planeta. Siempre con pueblos indígenas, donde quiera que estemos en cualquier país del mundo, nuestro principio es conservar la naturaleza, conservarlo, protegerlo, cuidarla y ahí tenerla siempre como para nosotros es algo que es sagrado, es delicado, porque eso nosotros lo defendemos y ese conocimiento lo tenemos que seguir transmitiendo porque somos los mejores ingenieros forestales. Sabemos que por qué sirve esto y en cuánto tiempo trabajamos con la rotación de la luna, en qué momento yo puedo ir a sembrar, en qué momento yo puedo cortar este árbol y cómo puedo, al cortar uno, cómo puedo ir replicando más, sembrando más y buscando más árboles. Entonces, toda esa parte de ese conocimiento es donde la juventud ha entrado a participar activamente para conocer ese conocimiento, construir una casa cultural. Yo quiero construir una casa cultural, pero ¿cómo se hace? Entonces, ahí están los mayores enseñando cómo se hace, por qué se hace, cuáles son los árboles que se usan para la construcción y todo ese conocimiento, de verdad. Y entonces, sí hemos aportado muchísimo. Yo creo que somos los mejores grupos, se puede decir, mejores territorios indígenas donde estamos aportando al cambio climático y sin necesidad que a mí me diga que hágalo. Es una forma de trabajo nuestro, es una forma de nuestra vivencia cultural de que tenemos que conservar y proteger y mejorar ahora con el tiempo de que estamos con el cambio climático, pues cada vez hacemos mejor las cosas. Cada vez aportamos más, si hay algo que mejorar, mejoramos, y hay algo que reactivamos. Si hay algo que aportar, aportamos, pero nosotros como territorios indígenas somos los mejores defensores del bosque, somos los que hemos aportado de generación en generación, somos las mejores escuelas ambientales y forestales a nivel mundial.
Gracias, Marissa. It is really very interesting to consider these things about how the pandemic is affecting all these efforts, and it sounds like it's work, but you're making some progress with the youth, which is great. I wanted to move on through the questions. We have so many good ones here, and I want to get to as many as we can. We have a question about raising the Indigenous voice. They said this is an issue across so many national and international platforms, but part of the problem is that those platforms and commissions and that kind of thing, this questioner is saying, are ultimately deaf to that voice. So how do you get them to genuinely listen and engage? Is there anyone who'd like to answer that one?
Yeah, I think I can respond that one.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Marissa.
Yeah, how we can genuinely recognize the voice of Indigenous people or the engagement of Indigenous peoples. For that one, as I would like to reiterate again what I said earlier, that the first of all, that we Indigenous people also need to understand our role and contribution, our contribution for the climate change resilience, because as earlier friends, I think Osvaldo also mentioned that many Indigenous people community, they think like maybe there was a curse because of our past, something we did bad, something happened. No, it's never, just always blaming themselves, right? But the reason of the climate change, the climate crisis, the environmental crisis is another one, right? So that kind of awareness is very important to be there. But the effective engagement is obviously building the capacity and level of awareness, as I said earlier, for the meaningful participation. I just want to give one examples of how the Indigenous peoples have contributed for climate change resilience, and that understanding is very, very fundamental to be understood, to be internalized, and see from the Indigenous people's worldview. The problem here is always the Indigenous people's traditional livelihoods, our practices, spiritual connectivity, always been seen like a compartment, right? Like a black and white. Okay, Indigenous people is there for climate change adaptation or mitigation or resilience or land tenures or what? No, but the problem is that Indigenous people worldview is it's a holistic worldview. Everything is interconnected like a spider web, right? One strand is being connected to another strands, because that's where the meaning comes from. The fundamental, like what been effort from the tenure facility for recognition of Indigenous people's customary governance system, their land and forest tenure, would be the basis for a recognition of their customary governance, their knowledge system, value system, because there is no legal recognition of Indigenous peoples in the discourse of climate change or discourse of land tenure security or anything like that. Because of that one, there's an absence of, there's a continuation of, kind of, losing the self-respect, that and not only losing the self-respect, but also not giving the importance of our knowledge, values, and our culture and spiritual. That is so wealth of knowledge to deal with this climate crisis. So that understanding is need to be understood, and this kind of discourse should be continued, global, regional, national, even local level, so that all the agencies be aware how important Indigenous people have been contributing. I just give you one example before I end. Like in Thailand, one case in Thailand where 39 Indigenous groups in Thailand. Karen is one of the communities. Karen is one of the Indigenous groups, highest numbers of the Indigenous groups. They have the different provision. I just want, they said they have the provision of all TQ Tau Thi, like if you drink water, you have to protect water. Another is all called Tiu Tau Kau, like if you use the forest, you should better take care. So see the province. Province is all comes from your culture, from your ritual practices. And also another part is in the current community, which is similar in Indigenous people in the Tarai belt of Nepal and also in India. that the umbilical cord, when the baby is born, the umbilical cord is tied in the forest, in the tree in the forest. So the umbilical cord is when it's been tied in the forest the tree represents the boy or the girl whose umbilical cord is been tied. So even after her death, the whole community believes the soul is there. So the trees it should be protected. So more the growth of the more you have population of indigenous people, more trees there. So see there, and when you have a more tree and the biodiversity conservation, you don't need to talk about like a whole modern kind of solution of resilience. See, if you just understand our culture values, there is a resilience, there is a nature-based solution, everything is there. But the thing is, we have to open our eyes with a holistic worldview of the indigenous.
No, it's really, I mean, these examples are so fascinating. And I think that leads really well into another question that we have here from someone who says that their experiences in Borneo, and they said that their indigenous communities, they know about climate change, but they don't know that they know about climate change. This is, the name isn't put on that thing that they know. And that can make it hard to find strategies to kind of elicit and draw out this knowledge effectively so that others can use it. I'm curious if any of our panelists have any good examples of how you've managed to pull something like that you've just been talking about out and use it to influence something broader or another community. Holly or Duncan or anyone else who's on the call?
Crack at that one.
Okay.
I mean, yeah, it is a big challenge, how to get these examples taken seriously. And I think probably the answer lies in organization. So working carefully to document stories from many different locations, but then perhaps channel them upwards into things like the Asian Farmers Association or the East African Farmers Federation. And these are big, powerful voting blocks that governments have to take seriously when they listen. I think in this world with there's so much information, decision makers are bombarded, and so I think it matters a lot who is speaking, and especially if organizations work together to form alliances, powerful alliances. I think that can really help. So I think the indigenous groups working on the if not us then who type platform, it's really clear messaging, very effective, and they represent lots and lots of people, and so that can be quite persuasive.
No, I can imagine, yeah, having the numbers behind it is a big help, right? And I often wonder whether there's not room even for kind of at the other end of the scale, just kind of good storytelling about this. Maybe we need some novels or theater or something that begins to pull these things into greater public consciousness.
I think that's right, and not allowing it to become the preserve of jargon. I mean, yes. There's so many terms out there on nature-based solutions, climate-based adaptation, sort of forest landscape restoration, integrated agriculture, climate-smart agriculture, and that puts the agenda in the hands of the experts. So keeping it simple and practical and stories are a good way of doing that.
Yeah, I think so. I wanted to ask, there's a question here that says, a lot of the large finance organizations, including the World Bank, are putting money into conservation finance. I mean, certainly we're seeing more examples almost by the day of different programs for this. And our questioner says that indigenous peoples and local communities are rarely considered directly in this, other than just being mentioned as lip service in it. Is there some way to influence these large, largely Western, global North organizations and really shift their attitude and approaches on this? Do any of our panelists have any experience with that? Holly, have you seen anything on that? Are you still with us?
Yeah, I hope so. I was
Yeah, we can hear
was
you.
Kicking me off every so often there. Sorry. Yeah, I think it's a question, and there's a lot of things starting to happen. As you said, Lori, not just big announcements of new funds and so on, but also some interesting processes within parts of the finance sector moving towards more transparency, more accountability, more focus on human rights and justice issues, and so on. So this is happening within private foundations in the philanthropic world. It's happening within stock exchanges, pressuring major oil and gas companies, for example, to disclose human rights, environmental impacts, and so on and so forth. So I think in the conservation industry, there's a real need to place more emphasis on human rights-based financing for conservation. So really requiring human rights to be respected and upheld in any funding that's going to, let's say, large conservation NGOs, to government agencies implementing protected areas, private actors, and so on. So there really needs to be much stronger emphasis on human rights in financing financial chains, I guess, and the supply chain. We can consider it almost a conservation supply chain, really. A lot of it is rooted in the financing part of that. So where is money coming from? Where is it going to, and how? So we need that. And absolutely, speaking back to the person who asked the question, there is a very tiny proportion of financing going directly to Indigenous peoples and local communities that absolutely needs to change. I mean, there are some agencies and institutions that, sorry.
We can hear you.
Came through, sorry. Spanish came through the English channel. So there are different agencies. There's the UNDP Small Grants Program. There's, as Duncan said in the chat, Forest and Farm Facility. There's a whole bunch of different small grant opportunities, a growing number of Indigenous-led foundations, which is super exciting, that are really rooted in Indigenous worldviews and values and so on. So I'd really love to see more of that happening, and strengthening Indigenous organizations' capacities to manage grants and to do these kinds of things themselves, so that it's not just co-opted by the big conservation NGOs.
It's interesting. Do you think that the kind of growing focus on ESGs and the kind of pressure around that can help drive that, or is that going to be not so helpful?
I think so. I mean, I think the conservation industry gets away with a lot of human rights issues and maybe also environmental issues, because it's this, conservation organizations, they're trying to do good things for the planet, so let's kind of look the other way when actually not very good things are happening. So there needs to be a lot more transparency and accountability among the major players in the conservation industry, as well as within the financing streams that are basically propping up those big conservation organizations and how they often operate. Yeah.
Thank you, Holly. It's really interesting. I think this next one is a question from Marissa. Our questioner is asking, what strategies can be adopted for strengthening the representation of Indigenous women in decision-making when their own leadership and mainstream patriarchal structures resist their agency as leaders? Marissa, can you tell us a little bit about that and just kind of what you've seen in those efforts? I know you mentioned it earlier. We'll wait for the translator to translate this for Marissa. Are you with us, Marissa?
I think she's been muted.
Can someone help Marissa unmute herself?
¿Me escuchan?
Yeah, now we hear you. Sí.
Ya, ok. Bueno, desde muchos años trabajo yo como lideresa del territorio indígena de mi territorio, pero hemos venido construyendo liderazgo y nos ha costado un poquito, pero al final de todo, ya cuando nos enfocamos desde la base de nuestro conocimiento, lo que es la importancia del liderazgo de la mujer desde la creación de la tierra, desde los principios culturales, nos damos cuenta que somos importantes desde que existimos. ¿Por qué? Porque se construye el liderazgo de la mujer indígena desde el principio cosmogónico de la dualidad. ¿Por qué? Porque hombres y mujeres somos importantes desde la creación, desde el principio. Entonces, de ahí es donde nace la participación de la mujer. Hoy se puede decir que no es que nosotros lo hemos logrado todo, porque siempre hemos tenido obstáculos, siempre hemos tenido cosas que quizás por el liderazgo como mujeres, el patriarcado siempre está por encima y nos ha costado un poco, pero hemos sabido liderar con todo ese principio cultural desde que nosotros nacemos, pues ya tenemos nuestro conocimiento cultural, el rol protagónico de la mujer como transmisora, como maestra de conocimiento, es la persona que enseña a sus hijos sobre los conocimientos culturales, ancestrales y también en la política. ¿Por qué? Porque estar en un liderazgo también requiere de conocimientos occidentales, conocimientos culturales, conocimientos tradicionales. Entonces, todo eso pues lo hemos aprendido y hoy puedo decir que hemos crecido en el territorio. Las mujeres hemos desarrollado proyectos importantes. Por ejemplo, hemos dejado una base concreta más allá de un discurso de que el sistema de producción tradicional, digamos, es una alternativa social, cultural, ambiental para la resiliencia ante el cambio climático, porque nosotros trabajamos en la producción. ¿Quién es el que enseña eso? Digamos, las mamás trabajando con sus hijos. ¿Quién es la que está ahí aportando? Entonces, todo eso hemos trabajado y hemos aportado y hemos puesto en práctica de forma tangible y visible en tiempos actuales los conceptos indígenas de uso de la tierra con un conocimiento viable sobre la soberanía alimentaria. Como mujeres que somos, como mujeres transmisoras de ese conocimiento, mujeres portadoras de ese conocimiento cultural, mujeres que estamos día a día con las familias, mujeres que hay obstáculos, pero nosotros también tenemos la capacidad para seguir adelante, para demostrar que sí se puede hacer las cosas. Y ahí es donde he sido muy ¿cómo se llama? Exigente con mis compañeras de que tenemos que crecer como mujeres, que tenemos que aprender a liderar en nuestras comunidades, porque como mujeres indígenas no es fácil de estar ahorita como estoy yo, no es fácil de estar en este medio, porque eso no es nuestra forma no lo practicamos, pero hay que esforzarse, hay que hacerlo por nuestra gente, por nuestro pueblo, por nuestro territorio, y hay mucha gente detrás de mí, hay una gran cantidad de gente que espera de mí, espera de las compañeras, espera de todos nosotros. Entonces nosotros tenemos que esforzarnos a aprender a aportar con estos conocimientos importantes en nuestra vida diaria. Y por ejemplo, una inversión que se haga en las mujeres hace cambios profundos en las vidas de la familia, de la comunidad y del territorio.
Muchas gracias, Maricela. I like the comment. It's not easy, but you have to do it, okay? Which is, I think, at the heart of a lot of what we're trying to do.
Sí, así es, hay que hacerlo. He aprendido poco a poco.
Yeah, exactly, little by little. I have another question for Oswaldo. You had mentioned this question of languages and loss of traditional language. I have someone asking, does the loss of indigenous languages impair the ability of traditional ecological knowledge to contribute to Western science toward a better understanding of the impact of climate change on the vulnerable ecosystems that Indigenous people occupy. I think essentially just asking, you know, how much does that loss of the Indigenous languages and the kind of knowledge that's tied up in those words hurt efforts to pass this on? I mean, to a wider audience, but even including in the own community. Osvaldo, can you address that one?
Sí, justamente yo quiero como recalcar nuestro pueblo indígena guaraní, no hemos perdido nuestro idioma, solo no hemos, la juventud no ha hecho la práctica de la sabiduría de los ancestros, de los abuelos. Entonces es una conexión muy importante que nosotros estamos recopilando la información. Por ejemplo, un ejemplo claro que voy a decir, mi pueblo pasa eso, ¿no? Los sabios son como columna vertebral de un pueblo que han liderado muchos años. Entonces, un abuelo, un sabio muere, es como perder un libro. Entonces, esto ha sido para nuestra preocupación como muy importante, como recopilar la información, y la juventud debe aprender ese conocimiento de un sabio, debe como transmitir antes que un abuelo, un sabio muere por la naturaleza, por enfermedad, pierde el conocimiento, pierde una parte de la historia del mundo. Wow, ahí está como conocimiento de medicina tradicional, como cómo es gobernanza del territorio, como espiritualidad a la cultura, al territorio. Eso ha sido como muy importante, y es no solo para nosotros, por pueblos indígenas, es como el resto del mundo, hay muchos pueblos. También sucede también, eso es parte de la sabiduría. También la pérdida de nuestro idioma, de otros indígenas que yo conozco aquí en la Amazonía, vivido muchos indígenas, somos diferentes, cultura, lenguaje, nuestro idioma es diferente, pero algunos van perdiendo también por la influencia del blanco mestizo en nuestro territorio. A veces la juventud se va a vivir a la ciudad para estudiar escuela. Entonces, ahí va como la pérdida ahí como es como se rompe la conexión del mundo indígena, de cultura hacia blanco mestizo, como a español, ¿no? Es como dejarlo una parte. Entonces, nosotros hemos llamado a nuestra comunidad, es como la cultura, el idioma, el territorio, es el principio ser guaraní o ser indígena. Y los tres principios se va, no funcionan, no es equilibrio. Entonces, por ahí va el como, más allá que estamos pensando como los principios es un pilar fundamental para un pueblo indígena, porque para un pueblo indígena debemos tener un territorio, un idioma propio y la cultura también. Eso es que ha sido muy importante. Si un indígena no habla su idioma, no, está como muriendo. Un indígena, si no tiene su hábitat, un territorio grande donde vivir, un indígena no vive sin territorio, sin selva, no muere. Entonces, con eso es parte de la vida de nosotros, ¿no? Entonces, eso amigos, compañeros.
It's so interesting what you say, you know, if to be in the territory is to be Guarani, I think that's a pretty big lesson for the rest of the world too, right? To be in our natural biodiversity and the richness of the world is to be human, to paraphrase him, I think. And that's why it's so important to be protecting this now, and why this kind of knowledge gives us the framework to do that. We're just about out of time. I'm really sorry we can't take more of your questions. I'm sure that our organizers could help get some of those answered or connect you up with people to find out. But we really appreciate you taking the time to listen and put those in. And I feel really privileged to have listened to such smart and passionate people for the last hour and a half. Thank you for that. And thanks to our hosts, the Ford Foundation, the Land Portal Foundation, the Tenure Facility, and my own Thomson Reuters Foundation. I wish we could have answered more questions, but I hope it was, enjoyable and thought-provoking. I certainly found it that. As a reminder, a recording of this session is going to be available in a few days. It might be a useful resource in your own ongoing work or to listen back on or share with others. And please do look out for the next one in this Land Dialogue webinar series. There's one a month, and I'm sure that people will be in contact through email, social media, or other means. So keep your eyes open. And thank you so much for joining us today. I know it's always a busy time, and we appreciate an hour and a half out of your day. Thank you.